The world grows quiet, and the story begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Sounds of Stories. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Sounds of Stories. Tonight, we open the first case from the files of Caleb Thorne. And since this is your first encounter with Thorne, allow me a brief introduction. Caleb Thorne's not a detective who relies on luck or dramatic confrontations. He solves mystery through observation, psychology, and the simple belief that every mystery is at its heart a question waiting to be asked correctly. Recording these cases is his friend and companion, Ashby, a thoughtful observer whose curiosity often mirrors our own. Through Ashby's eyes, we witness not only the mystery itself, but the remarkable mind that unravels it. Along with that, we've left a couple Easter eggs in the episode. If you find some, please leave them in the comments. Today's case is called The Empty House. And with that, let the pages turn. The Empty House, a Thorne File, Volume 1, Act 1. I have recorded a great many of Caleb Thorne's cases for the archive, but none that started so quietly or that I have put off transcribing so many times as the matter of the Marrow estate. Julian Marrow arrived at Thorne's office without an appointment, which, for a man of his net worth, I took to be a kind of tell in itself. People who can buy their way past a calendar rarely bother showing up in person unless something has frightened them past caring how it looks. "It's my niece Nadia," he said before he'd properly sat down. "I think someone's trying to kill her, and I can't tell you who because Warden says there's no one there." "Warden?" I asked. "The house system," Thorne said without looking up from his tablet. "Marrow Reach runs on it. Security, climate, the walls themselves. If Warden says no one's there, Mr. Marrow, most people would call that reassuring." "Most people don't live in that house," Marrow said. Thorne had him send Nadia in that afternoon and would not discuss theory until he had. She arrived looking like someone who had rehearsed calm so many times it had become its own kind of exhaustion. Nadia Marrow was perhaps 25, dressed with the deliberate neutrality of someone who no longer trusted her own instincts about what was normal. "I'm not sleeping," she said. "There's a sound in my duct behind my headboard. Every night after midnight, the same wall. And the HVAC kicks on at exactly 3 a.m. every night, whether the system's scheduled to or not. I've checked the logs myself. It shouldn't be doing that." "Huh, a fixed time," Thorne repeated, and something in his posture sharpened, though his voice stayed level. "Go on." She hesitated, the way people do right before the part they've decided in advance not to be believed for. "The walls in my room are LivingWalls, the e-ink panels. They cycle through ambient patterns automatically. Except mine doesn't cycle randomly anymore. At night, when the light catches at a certain angle, there's a shape in the pattern. A woman, moving. She's low, like she's looking for a seam to get through." She looked at her hands. "But she doesn't move until the HVAC starts." Thorne said nothing for a moment, filing that away with the stillness I'd come to recognize as his version of alarm. "And Warden?" he said. "Warden's flagged nothing, correct?" "Warden says the house is empty of anything it doesn't recognize. It said that every single night." "That," said Thorne, standing, "is either the most reassuring sentence I've heard all year, or the least. I intend to find out which." We drove out to the Marrow Reach the next afternoon, through a stretch of hills the GPS insisted had no signal, which Thorne found more interesting than the house itself once we arrived. The estate was a long, low structure of glass and dark timber, half buried into the hillside, a kind of architecture built specifically to be photographed from a drone. On the kitchen counter, beside a bank of unnecessary-looking touchscreens, sat a small ceramic bowl of milk, fresh, going by the absence of any skin on its surface. I assumed it was for a cat or some staff member's private ritual. Thorne didn't look at it twice. I've since wondered whether that was because he already understood it, or because he hadn't yet let himself. Act 2. The first thing Thorne did on arrival was ask Warden a direct question out loud, standing in the middle of the living room like a man addressing a very calm, very literal-minded butler. "Warden, have any unauthorized occupants entered this residence in the past 30 days? "No," the house said, in the flat, unhurried voice these systems always have, as though nothing in the world could possibly warrant urgency. "Then it's wrong," I said. "It has to be." "No," Thorne said. "It's almost certainly correct." He was already crouched by the baseboard, running a small handheld sensor along the seam where wall met floor. "This is precisely what troubles me." I asked him what he meant, and he didn't answer immediately, which was, with Thorne, its own kind of answer. "Everyone who's frightened of a smart house assumes the same story," he said eventually, "that someone's broken in, spoofed a camera, slipped past a sensor with a stolen badge. It's a satisfying story because it means the system failed." He stood, dusting off his knees. "But Warden hasn't failed, Ashby. Warden's been asked exactly one question over and over for 3 weeks, and has answered that question honestly every time. The trouble isn't the answer, it's the question. Which is anyone here who shouldn't be?" He looked at the wall. "Nobody has yet asked it what it doesn't know to look for." He spent the better part of an hour with the house's documentation after that, not the marketing brochure Nadia Marrow had proudly produced, but the actual commissioning specs buried 3 folders deep on a maintenance tablet nobody in the family had opened in years. Ductwork diagrams, sensor placement maps, a schedule of what Warden's cameras and motion detectors were configured to watch, and, more usefully, what they had never been configured to watch at all. "Warden," Thorne said again once he'd found what he wanted, "list all authorized maintenance routes not included in the public architectural plans provided to the family." A pause, longer this time, the kind of pause a machine takes not because it's thinking, but because no one has ever asked it that question before. "One route found," Warden said. "Subgrade utility corridor, section 4B, installed during construction, decommissioned from active monitoring in year 2 per contractor request." Thorne looked at me the way a man looks at someone who has just watched him win an argument he hadn't yet finished making. "Software rarely lies, Ashby," he said. "People simply ask it the wrong questions." The corridor itself ran beneath the east wing, unlit, narrow enough that Thorne had to turn sideways in places, connecting a disused equipment room to a service point directly behind Nadia's bedroom wall. On the way we passed what had once been a research annex, Julian's late brother's, according to the peeling label still taped to the door, a biotech researcher who had spent a decade studying venom-derived compounds for pharmaceutical use before his death. The annex itself was sealed behind a keypad that hadn't been reset in years, still logged under a service account nobody had thought to close. Inside, shelving still held sample cases, mostly empty, and a research log open on a desk exactly where someone had apparently stopped reading. A chapter heavily annotated on toxin delivery and dosage in live subjects. The house staff, when Thorne finally got one of them talking, remembered something else from the brothers' time. A specimen kept in a climate-controlled enclosure at the back of the annex. Something none of them would name directly, moved out officially years ago, though the enclosure itself, Thorne found, still drew power. And it was something Natalie had told me earlier. It was the living walls that troubled me more than any of it, though I couldn't have said why at first. Each morning I found some excuse to pass Nadia's door, and each morning the ambient pattern seemed subtly different from what I remembered. It was a curl of light closed here that had been open the day before, some shape in the pixels drawing tighter, as though the wall itself were rehearsing something it hadn't yet fully decided to become. I mentioned it to Thorne on the third day, expecting to be told I was imagining it. "The panels don't malfunction, Ashby," he said instead. "Only what's uploaded to them malfunctions." He wouldn't say more and turned instead to the panic button mounted by Nadia's bed, a standard emergency call feature wired according to the specs directly into the Warden's alert system. When he traced the actual physical connection, it terminated in a junction box that had never been wired to anything at all. A feature that existed only on a spec sheet and nowhere in the house itself. Thorne asked Nadia about it that afternoon, along with a good many other things. When she slept, when she woke, whether the HVAC glitch and the sound in the duct always came together or sometimes apart. She answered plainly until near the end when she added almost as an aside, "I never hear it when my uncle's traveling. He was in Singapore the second week of September, and I slept the whole 4 nights straight through." Thorne said nothing. He thanked her and asked instead about the LivingWalls firmware update schedule, and I thought no more of it at the time. He insisted each evening that there remained a complete technical explanation for all of it. The corridor, the annex, the dead panic button, the walls. He said it so often that I began to suspect that he was reassuring himself as much as he was me. But it was on the 4th night that I found him sitting outside Nadia's door well past midnight. I asked if he'd heard anything. "Nothing," he said too fast, and then, "A sound in the duct. Twice now. I've told myself it's the building settling." "Do you believe that?" He didn't answer. He only looked at the door and then for one long breath at the wall beside it, and I understood that for the first time since I'd known him, Caleb Thorne was afraid of being wrong in a direction he hadn't planned for. Act 3. He said nothing more that night, but by morning the fear had been folded away somewhere I wasn't permitted to see. He went to Nadia's room in full daylight, blinds up, and didn't so much as glance at the bed. He went straight to the wall with a small UV light and ran it slowly along the seam between 2 panels. Where the light caught, a thin line glowed faint blue against the rest of the panel, fresh polymer sealant laid recently enough that it hadn't yet fully cured and dulled like the rest. "This seam was sealed within the last day," Thorne said. "The rest of this wall hasn't been touched since installation." "Then the pattern is glitching," I said. "No." He turned to look at me. "You said the wall was changing, Ashby." "I did." "It wasn't changing." He clicked the light off. "Someone was changing it." I sat down on the edge of the bed rather heavily, and it took me a moment to see the whole shape of it. That every night while the house slept and Warden watched faithfully for everything it had been told to watch for, someone had peeling back a single panel, doing something behind it, and sealing it shut again before morning. The ambient pattern re-uploaded fresh each time to hide the seam. "Everyone keeps calling this the empty house," Thorne said mostly to himself, looking around the room. "It isn't empty." He was quiet for a moment. It was simply empty of everything Warden had been taught to fear. He laid it all out for Julian Marrow that afternoon in the main living room, methodically, without drama, the way a man reads out a bill. An HVAC cycle at a fixed hour with no scheduling record to explain it. A panic button, professionally installed, wired to nothing. Fresh milk every morning in a house with no cats. A research log on toxin delivery, read to pieces. A specimen enclosure that still draws power, though its occupant was supposedly rehomed years ago. A maintenance corridor Warden was never asked about, and a wall panel resealed every night over a hole that didn't need hiding unless something had been told to it that it did need hiding. He let that sit, then turned to me as he had before, as though the next line belonged to me and he was only waiting for me to say it. "Tell me, Ashby," he said, "if there's no cat in this house, who's drinking the milk?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I watched the answer land on Julian Marrow's face a half-second before it fully landed on mine. "Individually," Thorne went on, "every one of these things is explainable. A chime is only a chime. Milk is only milk. A button that doesn't work is, at worst, negligence." He paused longer than before. "But together, they don't describe a malfunction. They describe one journey. From an annex, through a corridor, into a wall, and back again, on a schedule as fixed as a train's." Julian Marrow said nothing at all, which I had begun to understand by then was itself an answer. That evening, Thorne asked the house for a set of precise measurements: bed to panic button to duck grill to headboard, and then, without a word of explanation, had the bed moved 18 inches from the wall. He told Nadia to sleep in it exactly as it stood, and would say nothing more about why. I don't think I've kept a longer watch than the one we kept outside her door that night. At 2:59, Thorne's hand closed once on my arm. The HVAC cycled on, precisely on schedule, exactly as it had for 3 weeks. And then, nothing. No cry, no alarm. Only the low mechanical hum of the duct, and very faintly from somewhere behind the wall, a soft searching scrape. Patient, unhurried, like something looking for a thing it had been told would be there. We didn't move until the room's automated blinds rose with the dawn schedule. When we opened the door, Nadia woke at the sound of it, startled but whole, in a bed that stood 18 inches from where her uncle had at last known it to be. Thorne smiled then, for the first time in that whole week. "The signal was precise," he said. "So was the aim." He looked at the gap of bare floor between the bed and the wall. "It simply aimed for where the bed used to be." The twist. We gathered at the main living room within the hour. Julian Marrow, Nadia, myself, and Thorne, who had asked with peculiar specificity that the milk be brought down from the kitchen counter and set on the coffee table between us. Julian had recovered a good deal of his composure by then, enough to manage something close to a smile of his own. "You've built quite a theory, Mr. Thorne," he said. "Corridors, milk, a research annex that had been sealed for years. I'd be careful accusing a man of anything on the strength of a bowl of milk." "I agree," said Thorne. "A theory isn't proof. Warden is." He turned toward the room at large, the way one might address a person rather than a wall. "Warden, has any unauthorized person entered Nadia Marrow's bedroom during the last 30 days? "No," said the house, unhurried as ever. Julian's smile held. "Warden," Thorne said, "has any unauthorized biological specimen been logged as leaving Research Annex 3 during the last 30 days? The pause this time was longer than any that had come before it. Not hesitation, only the sound of a system searching a category of question it had simply never been asked to consider. "Yes," Warden said. "Nightly departures logged via corridor sensor, Section 4B, beginning September 3rd. No return confirmation on record for any instance. Specimen registered under decommissioned research license, biological classification, restricted." Nobody spoke. Julian's smile did not so much fade as simply stop being used. Thorne knelt by the wall beneath Nadia's headboard, found the panel he'd marked that morning, and drew it free from its frame in one unhurried motion. Behind it was an opening no larger than a fist, cut clean through the insulation, its edges worn smooth with use. He set the bowl of milk on the floor directly beneath it and stepped back. We waited. I couldn't tell you how long, but it was long enough that I'd begun to doubt it would come at all, before something dark tested the rim of the opening. It was unhurried, patient, and then lowered itself, narrow and deliberate, toward the milk below. Nadia didn't flinch. I've thought about that more than almost anything else from that week, that the one person who had lived beside the thing longest was the only one among us who didn't. The room came apart around us all at once. Julian moving for the door, one of the staff shouting from the hallway, Thorne's voice cutting through it all, perfectly level, saying only, "Mind the milk," as though the rest of us had simply forgotten our manners. Julian didn't reach the door. Thorne had arranged for that before we'd ever come back into the house. The explanation. They took Julian out through the service entrance rather than the front, which struck me as the kind of small mercy nobody in that house had earned. Thorne and I stayed behind with the detective the local department eventually sent, and it was Thorne, not the arriving officer, who ended up laying out the whole of it. He laid it out patiently, and only once, as though he found repeating himself distasteful. "Motive first," he said, "since it's the simplest part." He nodded toward a folder the family's lawyer had produced within the hour, the kind of document that gets read only when someone has died or is about to. Nadia's father structured the trust so that Julian's control of the company's voting shares converts to permanent ownership only if Nadia doesn't reach 30 or dies before that age without heirs of her own. She's 25. Julian has run Marrow Reach Holdings as though it already belonged to him for years. It doesn't, not yet, not unless something happens to her first. "He could have contested the will," the officer said. "People do that all the time." "People who are confident of winning don't usually need 5 years in a research annex," Thorne said. "He tried the ordinary way. It failed. This was the extraordinary way." "And the how of it," the officer said. "Walk me through the how." "Opportunity, then." Thorne held up a hand and counted it off, finger by finger, the way I'd watched him do in Julian's own living room not 2 hours before. He had the annex, his brother's research, sealed but never actually decommissioned in any system that mattered. He had the specimen already trained to a recall signal from years of his brother's own conditioning work, which meant he inherited not just an animal, but a working method. He had the corridor because he was the one who approved the contractor's request to remove Section 4B from active monitoring, ostensibly to save on sensor licensing costs. And he had access to the LivingWalls firmware console under his own administrator credentials, which let him push a new ambient pattern to a single panel each night without anyone downstairs noticing a thing. "And Warden never caught any of it," I said, "because none of it was ever framed as a threat." "Warden was never lied to," Thorne said. "It was simply never asked. Julian didn't need to defeat the system. He only needed to understand it better than the people who trusted it, well enough to build his crime entirely inside the parts of the house nobody had thought to point it at." "Why like this, though?" the officer asked. "Why not something simpler?" "Because a body found with an unexplained toxin in a house full of surveillance is a murder," Thorne said. "A young woman who has been reporting sounds in the wall and hallucination for weeks found dead of the same is a tragedy. He wasn't only building a method of delivery, he was building a diagnosis. If it had gone on long enough without me, and she hadn't died of it outright, I suspect he meant for her to be declared unfit to manage her own shares long before he needed her to die at all." Nobody said anything for a moment after that. "The milk," the officer said eventually, glancing at the bowl still sitting on the coffee table as though it might do something on its own. "That's what confuses me most. Why leave something so visible for something so careful?" "Because he wasn't attending to it," Thorne said. "The staff were. He told them years ago it was for a stray that came around the property, and by now none of them thought to question it any more than they questioned the panic button or the corridor or the annex door." The most dangerous part of a well-built lie isn't the lie itself, it's how quickly everyone around it stops noticing there was ever a lie to check. He looked for a moment toward the hallway where Nadia sat with a blanket around her shoulders, giving her own statement to a second officer in a voice steadier than I would have managed in her place. "She never stopped noticing," Thorne said. "That's the part he didn't account for. He built a method that depended on everyone believing her before he did. The AI, the staff, even her own uncle. He simply never planned for her to keep believing herself." Well, there you have it, everyone. What began as whispers in the walls in a house that seemed to hide impossible secrets became something far more unsettling. A reminder that the greatest dangers are often not supernatural at all, but carefully engineered by ordinary people with extraordinary motives. In The Empty House, Caleb Thorne reminds us that technology can answer only the questions we think to ask, and that the smallest overlooked detail can unravel even the most elaborate deception. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and join me for the next Thorne File. There are many more cases waiting in the archive, and each one asks a different question about the nature of truth, fear, and the people who hide behind both. If you want more narration by me, Bobby Garrison, please visit thesoundsofstories.com or hit the link in the description. And thanks for spending your time here with us at The Sounds of Stories. Come back for another adventure. And remember, when the world seems to fade, the stories always remain.